How a P-51 Mustang survived against superior numbers. 26 minutes, that's how long it takes. Not to break the sound barrier, not to win a medal, just to stay alive. His name was Charles Elwood Yeager. He was 21 years old, the son of a natural gas driller from Hamlin, West Virginia, a town of 900 people where his father came home smelling of methane and clay, and his older brother had taught him to shoot a squirrel in the eye at 150 yards when he was 6. On the morning of October 12th, 1944, at 28,000 feet above the German city of Bremen, that West Virginia farm boy looked down through his canopy and saw 22 Messerschmitt fighters climbing toward the American bombers he was paid to protect. 22. He counted them twice, because his brain refused to accept the number the first time. Behind him, in 300 B-24 Liberators, 300 American boys. Sons and brothers and husbands from Iowa and Alabama and Pennsylvania were flying toward the target without knowing what was coming. Boys who would not see the attack until it was too late. Yeager had 3 choices. He could run, point his P-51 Mustang toward England, and let 300 bomber crewmen burn alive at 22,000 feet. He could wait for his squadron, 6 minutes behind him, too far to help. Or he could do the one thing that every flight manual, every instructor, every rational calculation in the United States Army Air Forces said would kill him. In the next 26 minutes, he would destroy 5 German fighters, 2 of them without firing a single bullet. And when he landed at RF Leiston that afternoon, he would have less than 1 second of ammunition left across all 6 guns. This is the story of how a mechanic's son from a coal country town, a boy who had never seen an airplane until he was 19, became the man who 3 years later would break the sound barrier with 2 broken ribs and a piece of a broomstick. But first, he had to survive the 26 minutes above Bremen, and the clock was already running. The boy who would one day fly faster than sound was born in a 2-room house with no electricity on the 13th of February, 1923, in Myra, West Virginia. Myra doesn't appear on most maps. It sits in a fold of the Appalachian Hills where the Mud River carves a slow bend through the coal country of Lincoln County. There were 900 people in the nearest town of Hamlin. There were fewer in Myra. The Yeagers were poor in the specific American way that poverty existed in the 1920s Appalachian coalfields. Not desperate, not starving, but stripped down to essentials. A wood stove, a single bulb hanging from a wire in the kitchen, a father named Albert Hal Yeager, who worked the natural gas fields with his hands and came home smelling of methane and clay. Chuck was the second of 5 children. His older brother Roy taught him to shoot when he was 6 years old. By the time he was 12, he could hit a squirrel in the eye at 150 yards with a .22 rifle. Not the body, the eye, because his father had taught him that a body shot ruined the meat. This is the first thing you need to understand about Chuck Yeager. Before he was a fighter pilot, before he was an ace, before he was the first man to break the sound barrier, he was a hunter, and a hunter learns something that a soldier can never be taught in a classroom. A hunter learns to see the animal before the animal sees him. He was not a bright student. His grades at Hamlin High School were average. His teachers remembered him as polite, quiet, and stubbornly practical. The kind of boy who could take apart a broken radio and put it back together, but couldn't tell you what a metaphor was. He graduated in June of 1941. He had no plans. He had no money for college. The Great Depression had ended in the cities, but it had not yet ended in West Virginia. The only real employer in the county was the coal mine. And Chuck Yeager, at 18 years old, had already decided he was not going into a hole in the ground. 3 months later, on September 12, 1941, he walked into a recruiting office and enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces. He didn't enlist to fly. He enlisted to fix things. His paperwork lists him as an aircraft mechanic, private, second class. Pay, $50 a month. He was sent to Victorville, California, to work on the ground crews servicing the AT-6 Texan trainers. He liked the work. He liked machines. He liked the way an engine spoke to you, if you knew how to listen. Then, in July of 1942, everything changed. The Army posted a notice on the bulletin board at Victorville. Enlisted men with high school diplomas could apply for the newly created Flying Sergeants Program, a wartime experiment to churn out pilots faster than the traditional officer pipeline could manage. The pay was $75 a month. Chuck Yeager filled out the application because it paid $25 more than what he was making. He had never been in an airplane in his life. His first flight, 3 weeks later, in a Stearman biplane over the flatlands of Kern County, California, made him violently airsick. He vomited into his flight suit. His flight instructor watched the 19-year-old kid from West Virginia wipe his mouth on his sleeve and prepared to wash him out of the program. But Yeager asked to go up again the next day, and the next, and the next. Somewhere in the third week of training, something clicked. Not intellectually, not in his head. Somewhere lower, in his hands, in his hips, in the small of his back. His instructor later said that Yeager didn't fly the airplane. He wore it. By January of 1943, he was a flight officer with silver wings and orders to a fighter group forming up in Tonopah, Nevada. It was called the 357th, and it was going to be the first unit in the 8th Air Force to fly a brand new fighter that nobody in combat had ever tested, the North American P-51 Mustang. He met her at a USO dance in Oroville, California, in the summer of 1943. Her name was Glennis Faye Dickhouse. She was 20 years old. She worked as a secretary in the local Chamber of Commerce. She had brown hair and a directness that reminded him of the women back home in West Virginia, women who did not have time for nonsense. He asked her to dance. She said no. He asked her again the next Saturday. She said no. The third Saturday, she said yes. And the fourth Saturday, he told her he was going to name his airplane after her. She laughed at him. She thought he was joking. He wasn't. In November of 1943, the 357th Fighter Group shipped out for England. Yeager left behind a photograph of Glennis on the dresser of his boarding house and a promise that he would come back. He carried a smaller copy of the same photograph folded inside his flight jacket next to a rabbit's foot his mother had given him. The 357th arrived at Raiden Wood in Suffolk on November 29, 1943. They transitioned to their permanent base at RF Leiston in January of 1944. They flew their first combat mission on February 11th. Yeager scored his first confirmed kill on March 4, 1944, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 over Berlin. 24 hours later, he was dead. Not literally. But by every measure, the United States Army Air Forces used to track its men. Second Lieutenant Charles E. Yeager ceased to exist on the morning of March 5, 1944. He was flying bomber escort over occupied France near the town of Angoulême. His flight was jumped by 3 Focke-Wulf 190s coming out of the sun. Yeager never saw them. The first burst of 20-millimeter cannon fire hit his engine, his coolant lines, and his rudder pedals almost simultaneously. His P-51B, the first aircraft he had ever named Glamorous Glen, came apart around him at 18,000 feet. He bailed out with a piece of shrapnel in his right calf and another in his left hand. He landed in a pine forest in the Gascony region. He was 20 years old. For the next 4 weeks, Chuck Yeager did not exist. The French resistance, the Maquis of the Southwest, the men and women who had gone into the hills and forests when the Germans occupied their country, moved him from farmhouse to farmhouse, from barn to barn, always at night, always on foot. He slept in root cellars. He ate cold potato soup. He learned to say 7 words of French. He watched a teenage girl hide his American dog tags in the false bottom of a flour barrel while a German patrol searched her kitchen 3 feet away. He learned that the resistance had rules. If you were captured, you had 30 seconds of silence before they started asking questions. 30 seconds to give the men who had helped you time to disappear. 30 seconds to make sure the names of the teenage girls in the farmhouses did not become confessions on a torture floor in Bordeaux. He also learned that survival had a price. In late March, moving toward the Spanish border with a guide known only by the code name Pancho, Yeager encountered a German checkpoint. There was no negotiation. There was no discussion. He shot 2 German soldiers with a .45 caliber pistol borrowed from Pancho and kept walking. He crossed the Pyrenees on foot in a snowstorm. He was captured by Spanish authorities on the other side and held in a hotel that functioned as a soft internment camp. Franco's Spain was neutral in name only. It took the American consulate 6 weeks and a series of quiet negotiations to get him released. On May 15, 1944, Chuck Yeager walked back onto the tarmac at WWII Leiston. He was 22 pounds lighter. He had a limp, he had a beard, and he had a problem. Because in the 6 weeks between his shoot-down and his return, the United States Army Air Forces had made a decision about him. It was a decision written in bureaucratic language on a piece of paper filed at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. And it said, in essence, this: Second Lieutenant Charles E. Yeager will not fly combat missions in the European Theater of Operations, ever again. The reason was called the Escape and Evasion Protocol. Any American airman who had been sheltered by the resistance and had returned to Allied lines carried inside his memory the names, faces, and locations of dozens of French civilians who had risked execution to save him. If that airman went back into the sky and was shot down a second time and captured, the Gestapo would extract everything. The teenage girl would die. Pancho would die. The families in the farmhouses would die. The rule was not negotiable. It was not appealable. It was a wall. Chuck Yeager decided to walk through it anyway. He and another evaded pilot named Fred Glover requested a personal meeting with the Supreme Commander himself, General Dwight David Eisenhower, age 54. The man responsible for every Allied soldier in Europe. The meeting took place in mid-June of 1944 at Eisenhower's forward headquarters, less than 2 weeks after the D-Day landings. Yeager and Glover walked into a room the size of a broom closet and stood at attention in front of a 5-star general who was, at that moment, running the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Yeager was 21 years old. He had a ninth-grade vocabulary and a West Virginia accent so thick that Eisenhower reportedly asked him twice to slow down. He made his argument in less than 4 minutes. The resistance, he said, was no longer underground. Since D-Day, the Maquis had come out into the open. They were fighting the Germans in the streets of French towns. There was nothing left to protect. The escape and evasion protocol was a rule written for a war that had already ended. Eisenhower listened. He said nothing for a long time. Then he told Yeager and Glover that he did not have the authority to overturn the protocol on his own. But he could take it to the War Department in Washington. He did. And in late June of 1944, permission came back through the chain of command with Eisenhower's personal endorsement. Chuck Yeager was cleared to return to combat. He walked out of the 357th Fighter Group's operations building on the morning of June 26, 1944, climbed into a brand-new P-51 Mustang and started writing his name on the nose in white paint. He wrote it slowly. He wrote it the way he had promised her a year earlier at that dance in Oroville, California. Glamorous Glennis. By early October of 1944, he had 5 confirmed kills. By the morning of October 12th, he had a squadron of B-24 bombers behind him and 22 Messerschmitts climbing up from the German countryside to meet him, and a Luftwaffe that was no longer what it used to be. To understand what happened on the morning of October 12th, 1944, you have to first understand what had happened to the Luftwaffe. In the winter of 1939, when the German Air Force marched into Poland, it was the most feared military aviation organization on Earth. Its pilots were veterans of the Spanish Civil War. Its tactics, the Finger Four formation, the Schwarm, the boom and zoom energy fight, had been developed by a young officer named Werner Mulders, a man who understood aerial combat the way a chess grandmaster understands the middle game. By 1940, over the beaches of Dunkirk and the fields of southern England, the Luftwaffe was a scalpel. By October of 1944, it was a butter knife. The reasons were not tactical, they were arithmetic. In the 20 months between February of 1943 and October of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 22,000 combat aircraft and, more importantly, the men who had flown them. During a single week in February of 1944, that American planners called Big Week, the 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force conducted a coordinated bombing campaign against German aircraft factories that broke the back of Luftwaffe pilot training. Not because the factories stopped producing planes, but because every American bombing raid required a Luftwaffe interception, and every interception cost the Germans veteran pilots they could not replace. By October of 1944, the average German fighter pilot going into combat had roughly 100 to 100 or 150 hours of flight training. The average American fighter pilot going into combat had roughly 400 hours. Let that sit for a moment. The men climbing to intercept Chuck Yeager on the morning of October 12th, 1944, were boys. Some of them were 18 years old. Some had never fired at another aircraft before. They flew the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, a machine that had been the queen of the skies in 1941, but was now, by late 1944, being outperformed at high altitude by the very P-51D that was hunting them. They had good airplanes. They had famous uniforms. They had the tradition of the German officer corps behind them. They did not have 400 hours in the cockpit. And in a fighter, hours are the only currency that matters. This is the part of the story that gets left out of the newsreels. Chuck Yeager did not defeat the Luftwaffe of 1940 that morning. He defeated the Luftwaffe of 1944. That is not a diminishment of what he did. It is the context that makes what he did survivable. Now, with that in your mind, climb into the cockpit. It is mid-morning. The sky above Bremen is the color of washed-out steel. The temperature at 28,000 feet is 40 degrees below zero. Yeager's oxygen mask has ice on it from his own breath. His left hand rests on the throttle. His right hand rests on the stick. His feet rest on the rudder pedals. His body is doing what all fighter pilots' bodies do in the last minute before contact, running an inventory. Fuel, ammunition, position of the sun, position of the wingmen, position of the enemy. Below him, at 24,000 feet, 22 black dots are climbing. He counts them twice. Not because he cannot count, because his brain is trying to negotiate with reality. He keys the microphone. His voice is flat as a piece of glass. Bounce them, and Chuck Yeager pushes the stick forward. The P-51 Mustang has one particular gift that no other piston fighter in the war fully shared. It is called energy retention. When you dive a Mustang, the airframe holds the speed it accumulates. When you pull up, the speed converts back into altitude with almost no loss. The airplane behaves less like a machine and more like a pendulum, trading height for velocity. Velocity for height, in a rhythm the pilot can feel in his bones if he knows what he's doing. Yeager knew what he was doing. He came down through the Bf 109 formation from directly above, at an angle of 60 degrees, at a speed of 480 miles per hour. The Germans saw him too late. They saw him not because they were looking. They saw him because the shadow of his aircraft crossed the canopy of the lead 109, and the pilot instinctively looked up. By then, Yeager was already firing. He had picked his target on the way down, the rearmost 109 in the trailing Schwarm. He gave the aircraft a 2-second burst from 300 yards. His 6.5 caliber Browning M2 machine guns put approximately 200 rounds of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition into a piece of German airplane the size of a bathtub. The 109 did not explode. It came apart. The left wing separated at the root and pinwheeled away. The fuselage rolled inverted and began the long tumble toward the fields below. That was kill number 1, and it was the last kill of the engagement that would happen in the way flight school taught it. Because now Chuck Yeager did something that only pilots of a specific temperament ever do. He did not extend. He did not climb back to altitude. He did not regroup with his wingman. He turned into the formation. There were still 21 Bf 109s in the sky around him. He had one Mustang, 6 machine guns, and a Merlin engine that was already running hot from the dive. Every tactical manual in the United States Army Air Forces said that when you are outnumbered 21-1, you use your speed to disengage. Yeager pulled the stick into his stomach and rolled left directly into the middle of the German formation. What happened next lasted approximately 11 seconds, and it is the reason that Chuck Yeager, over the next 76 years of his life, would answer questions about October 12th, 1944, with the same 3 words. I got lucky. He didn't. But you can see why he thought so. As Yeager came slicing through the middle of the swarm, two German pilots, young, undertrained, and now suddenly staring at a P-51 filling their canopies from a direction that made no aerodynamic sense, reacted the way panicked 18-year-olds react. The pilot on the left broke hard left. The pilot on the right broke hard left. Their wings intersected at approximately 22,000 feet. The collision was not a glancing blow. It was a full structural failure of both aircraft. The left wingtip of the right-hand 109 caught the tail assembly of the left-hand 109, and both machines came apart in a cloud of aluminum, glycol, and aviation fuel. Neither pilot fired a shot. Neither pilot was pursued. Both pilots bailed out. Yeager, watching over his shoulder as he came out of the roll, saw two white parachutes blossom against the grey German sky. Later, in the debriefing room at RF Leiston, when the intelligence officer asked him to reconstruct the sequence, Yeager would use one sentence that would end up in the Army Times article 5 months later. It was almost comic, scoring 2 quick victories without firing a shot. Kills 2 and 3, confirmed by the gun camera footage of every other Mustang in the flight, because Yeager's own gun camera showed nothing. His triggers had never been squeezed. 9 minutes into the engagement, 19 Bf-109s remaining, and Yeager was still climbing. Now the Germans had lost their formation. This is the moment where a well-trained Air Force reforms, where the surviving pilots regroup into their schwarms, re-establish their wingman pairs, and re-attack in a coordinated push. This is what Werner Mölders would have done in 1940. This is what Hans-Joachim Marseille would have done in 1942. The boys of the Bf-109 formation in the sky above Bremen on October 12, 1944, did not do any of those things. They scattered. Some climbed, some dove, some turned east toward home, a handful, perhaps 4 or 5. No one has ever agreed on the exact number, turned to fight. And of those, 3 of them made the specific tactical mistake that separates a fighter pilot who lives from a fighter pilot who dies. They tried to turn with a Mustang. The Bf-109 G6 was a fast airplane. It was a strong climber. It could outroll a P-51 at low speed. What it could not do, what no version of the Bf-109 could ever do, was outturn a Mustang in a horizontal fight above 20,000 feet. The Mustang had a laminar flow wing that generated less drag at high speeds. In a sustained turn, the P-51 would slowly, inevitably, tighten its radius until it was inside the German's turning circle. From inside the circle, the German became a target. Yeager selected the nearest 109. He rolled behind it. He waited. At 600 yards, he began to fire in short, disciplined bursts. 1 second, 1 second, 1 second. He was not spraying ammunition. He was placing it. This was the hunter from the West Virginia hills, doing what he had done his entire life, not firing, aiming. The 109 caught fire on the 3rd burst. Yeager watched it roll onto its back and begin to spin. He did not follow it down. He was already looking for the next target. Kill number 4. The next Bf-109 pilot did something interesting. He saw Yeager coming, and he did not try to run. He rolled inverted, split S toward the ground, and pulled into a vertical dive. It was the same maneuver the Luftwaffe had been using since 1940. Dive away from the threat, use gravity to build speed, escape at low altitude. It was a maneuver designed to defeat a P-47 Thunderbolt, which locked up in high-speed dives. It was not a maneuver designed to defeat a P-51 Mustang, which did not. Yeager rolled inverted and followed him down. At 18,000 feet, the German began to pull out. At 16,000 feet, Yeager was 400 yards behind him and closing. At 14,000 feet, Yeager was 200 yards behind him and inside firing range. He fired one burst, 1 second of trigger time. The 109 came apart. Kill number 5. The debriefing officers would later ask Yeager to describe this specific engagement in detail because it was the moment that made him an ace in a single mission, the first pilot in the entire 357th Fighter Group to achieve that distinction. And Yeager, in his slow West Virginia cadence, gave them the sentence that would become the most quoted line of his entire wartime career. "I opened up that 19 as if it were a can of Spam." He said it without smiling. He said it the way a butcher would describe cutting meat. By this point, the engagement had lasted approximately 22 minutes. Yeager was low on fuel. His engine was running hotter than he liked. His ammunition counter was showing warning lights. He looked around. The sky was empty. The remaining Bf-109s had disengaged and were streaming east, back toward their bases. Yeager did not pursue them. A pilot who chases a fleeing enemy at the end of a long engagement is a pilot who runs out of fuel over enemy territory. Yeager was not that pilot. He had come here to protect the bombers. The bombers were now safely past. His job was done. He rejoined the tail end of the American formation at 26,000 feet. His wingman, Lieutenant Murray, saw him climbing up and slid into position on his right wing without saying a word. Neither of them spoke on the radio. There would be time for that later. The flight home to RF Leiston took 90 minutes. Yeager landed in the early afternoon. When the ground crew climbed onto the wing of glamorous Glennis, the crew chief looked into the cockpit and saw a 21-year-old kid sitting very still, staring straight ahead, his hands still on the controls. "Captain?" the crew chief said. "You okay?" Yeager did not answer for a moment. Then he unclipped his oxygen mask and let it hang against his chest. He looked at the crew chief and gave him a small nod. "5, he said quietly. The crew chief thought he meant something else at first. 5 hours in the air. 5,000 feet on the altimeter. It took him a second to understand. 5 kills in one mission. The crew chief climbed down off the wing and started running toward the operations building. Yeager sat in the cockpit alone for another minute or two before he unstrapped and climbed out. He walked across the tarmac in silence. The 357th Fighter Group had destroyed 8 Bf-109s that morning. It had not lost a single Mustang. The Silver Star citation would be written that same evening. The Associated Press wire story would go out on the transatlantic cable the following day, initially reporting 4 kills, before being corrected to 5 when the gun camera footage from the other pilots was developed. But none of that had happened yet. In the moment that Chuck Yeager climbed out of the cockpit of glamorous Glennis on the afternoon of October 12th, 1944, there was only the sound of the wind moving across the airfield, the distant chatter of ground crews servicing other aircraft, and a fighter pilot walking slowly toward the debriefing room with his flight helmet under his arm. He had 6 confirmed kills before the morning began. He had 11 by the time he sat down, and he still had a war to fight. The Silver Star came through in November. There was a small ceremony at RAF Leiston. Colonel Donald Graham pinned the medal on Yeager's flight jacket. in front of the assembled squadron. The photograph they took that afternoon still exists. Yeager is standing at attention. His expression is somewhere between a soldier receiving an award and a farmer trying not to look uncomfortable in a suit at church. He is 21 years old. He looks 40. On November 6, 1944, 25 days after Bremen, he did something that no one in the United States Army Air Forces believed was possible. He shot down a jet. The Messerschmitt Me-262 was the future of aerial warfare. Twin Jumo 004 turbojet engines. A top speed of 540 miles per hour, 120 miles per hour, faster than the fastest Mustang. 4 30mm cannons in the nose that could tear an American bomber in half with a single burst. When the 262 first appeared in combat in the summer of 1944, Allied pilots reported it with the disbelief that men in 1914 had reported seeing tanks for the first time. Something new had entered the sky, something that changed the rules. The 262 had exactly one vulnerability. Its jet engines were unreliable in throttle transitions. On takeoff and landing, the aircraft was slow, low, and unable to accelerate quickly. Yeager knew this. Every experienced Mustang pilot in the 8th Air Force knew this. But knowing it and catching a 262 in that specific window were two different things. On the morning of November 6th, Yeager was flying a bomber escort mission near Osnabrück when he spotted a 262 descending toward the German airfield at Achme. The German pilot was on his final approach, landing gear down, flaps extended, throttled back to about 200 miles per hour. Yeager was at 5,000 feet directly above him. He rolled inverted. He split-est straight down. The 262 pilot never saw him coming. Yeager fired a 2-second burst from 400 yards. The jet's left engine caught fire. The aircraft skidded off the runway and exploded in a field beside the taxi apron. The Distinguished Flying Cross was pinned to Yeager's jacket in December. He flew his last combat mission on January 14, 1945. He and Bud Anderson, his wingman, his best friend, the man who would remain his brother-in-arms for the next 75 years, signed on for the day's mission as spares. Spares are the pilots you use when someone drops out at the last minute. If everyone shows up, the spares don't fly the mission. They fly patrol. Which meant that on January 14th, 1945, Chuck Yeager and Bud Anderson had permission to fly wherever they wanted over occupied Europe, at whatever altitude they wanted, doing whatever they wanted, for as long as their fuel held out. They flew for 3 hours. They chased trains. They buzzed a barge on the Rhine. They flew low enough over a French village that Yeager could see a woman looking up at them from her garden, one hand shielding her eyes from the sun. When they landed at Leiston that afternoon, Yeager climbed out of glamorous Glennis for the last time in combat. He had 11.5 confirmed kills. He had one of the Me-262 jet kills that only a handful of Mustang pilots would ever record. He had a Silver Star, a Distinguished Flying Cross, an Air Medal with multiple oak leaf clusters, a Purple Heart, and waiting for him back in California, a woman named Glennis, who had been reading his letters for 2 years and did not know how many of them she would receive before one of them stopped coming. He shipped home in February. He married Glennis Faye Dickhouse in a small ceremony in Hamlin, West Virginia, on February 26, 1945. He was 22 years old. She was 21. Neither of them owned a car. The war ended for Germany 3 months later. The war ended for Japan 4 months after that, and Chuck Yeager, expecting to muster out of the army and go home to fix tractors in West Virginia, was instead handed orders to report to a small airfield in the high desert of California. The airfield was called Muroc Army Airfield. Today it is called Edwards Air Force Base. In the summer of 1945, it was an experimental flight test facility where the Army sent its pilots to fly aircraft that the American public did not yet know existed. Yeager was assigned there because his commanding officer had watched him land a Mustang with a jammed rudder in November of 1944 and made a note in his file that said, in essence, "This man is not a pilot. This man is a test instrument." For 2 years, Yeager flew experimental prototypes, jets, rocket planes, aircraft with swept wings, forward swept wings, no wings at all. He was assigned to a program the Air Force had inherited from the Bell Aircraft Corporation, a small, bullet-shaped rocket plane called the X-1. Its official name was Glamorous Glennis. Yeager had painted it on the fuselage himself, in white paint, the same way he had painted it on the nose of every Mustang he had ever flown. The X-1 had one purpose. It was designed to fly faster than sound. In the 1940s, this was not just a technical challenge. It was widely believed to be physically impossible. There was a phenomenon that pilots called the sound barrier. As an aircraft approached the speed of sound, approximately 767 miles per hour at sea level, the air molecules ahead of the wings began to compress. Control surfaces became unresponsive. Aircraft began to shake themselves apart. In 1946, a British test pilot named Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. had died attempting to break the barrier in an experimental jet. His aircraft came apart at Mach 0.94. The consensus among aerodynamicists in 1946 was clear. The sound barrier was a wall. Any pilot who reached it would die. Yeager was scheduled to fly the X-1 on the morning of October 14, 1947. 2 nights before the flight, he took Glennis horseback, riding at a ranch called Pancho Barnes Fly-In, a bar and dude ranch on the edge of the Mojave Desert that served the test pilot community. It was a Sunday evening. The sun was setting. Yeager was 34 hours away from attempting to break the sound barrier. His horse tripped on a rabbit hole and threw him. He landed on his right side against a rock. He heard something crack inside his chest. He did not go to the base flight surgeon. He knew what would happen if he did. The flight surgeon would ground him. The X-1 flight would be delayed. Some other pilot, probably Bob Hoover, his backup, would climb into the cockpit and take the shot at history. Instead, Yeager went into town the next morning and found a civilian veterinarian. The veterinarian confirmed 2 broken ribs. He wrapped Yeager's chest in tape and told him not to lift anything heavy for 6 weeks. Yeager thanked him. He drove back to Muroc. He told no one except Glennis and Bob Hoover. The X-1 was designed to be launched from the belly of a B-29 bomber. The pilot climbed into the cockpit while the aircraft was still on the ground, sealed the door from the inside, and rode up to 20,000 feet inside the mothership before dropping free. The problem was that the X-1's cockpit door was heavy. It required a 2-handed pull with the right arm fully extended to close and latch it. Yeager could not lift his right arm above his shoulder. On the morning of October 14, 1947, standing on the ramp at Muroc in his flight suit, Chuck Yeager and Bob Hoover walked out to the maintenance hangar. They found a broomstick. They sawed off a 10-inch length of it. Yeager slipped the piece of broomstick into his flight suit pocket. The plan was simple. He would climb into the X-1 with his left hand supporting his right. Once the door was closed, he would use the broomstick as a lever, inserting it into the door handle and pulling it toward himself with his left arm, using the wooden shaft to compensate for the arm he couldn't fully extend. He did not tell the ground crew what the broomstick was for. He did not tell his commanding officer. He climbed into the X-1 at 10:00 in the morning. He closed the door with a piece of broomstick. He was dropped from the B-29 at 20,000 feet at 10:26 a.m. He fired the 4 rocket engines in sequence. The X-1 accelerated to Mach 0.85, then Mach 0.9, then Mach 0.94, the speed at which Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. had died the year before. Then, at 10:30 a.m., over the dry lake bed of the Mojave Desert, the needle on Yeager's Mach meter jumped past 1.0 and stopped registering. On the ground, radar tracking stations recorded a sonic boom for the first time in human history, a sound that no one on Earth had ever heard before that morning. Chuck Yeager, 24 years old, had just flown faster than sound. He had done it with 2 broken ribs and a piece of broomstick, and he had told his commanding officer none of it. The story of the broomstick and the broken ribs did not become public for 8 years. Yeager kept it quiet because he was afraid he would be grounded retroactively. When it finally came out, in a magazine interview in 1955, it was reported as a curiosity, a colorful footnote, the kind of thing test pilots did. But it was not a footnote. It was the same man who had flown into 22 Messerschmitts alone above Bremen 3 years earlier. It was the same set of hands, the same nervous system, the same quiet farm boy who had learned to shoot at 150 yards before he was 12. It was the same instinct that had said, on October 12, 1944, at 28,000 feet over Germany, "Don't run." Chuck Yeager continued to fly for the United States Air Force for another 28 years. He retired as a brigadier general in 1975. He continued to fly experimental and civilian aircraft into his 80s. He was still flying chase planes for NASA at an age when most men have long since stopped driving cars. Glenys Faye Yeager, glamorous Glenys herself, died of ovarian cancer on December 22, 1990. She was 66 years old. She had been married to Chuck Yeager for 45 years. She had followed him to every airfield he was ever stationed at. She had raised 4 children in 22 different houses. Yeager did not remarry for nearly 2 decades. He died on December 7, 2020. He was 97 years old. He died on the 79th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The attack that had, 3 months later, sent him into the recruiting office in Hamlin at the age of 18 with no plan except to avoid the coal mines. The circle closed exactly. Among his personal effects, his family found the flight logbook from the European theater. It is preserved today in a climate-controlled archive at the National Air and Space Museum. The pages are yellow. The handwriting is small and neat and economical. The entry for October 12, 1944, is 9 lines long. It records the aircraft type, the mission duration, the rounds of ammunition fired, and the outcome. There is no drama. There is no adjective. There is only the data. The bottom of the entry, in the same neat handwriting, someone, presumably Yeager himself, at some point later in his life, added a single line that is not standard logbook procedure. It reads, 22 of them, 8 down, no losses. He never wrote a memoir about that day specifically. When he was interviewed about it in his later years, he answered the same way every time, in the flat, unimpressed cadence of a West Virginia farm boy who had spent his entire life being asked to explain things he considered obvious. He would say that the German pilots were tired. He would say the P-51 was a hell of an airplane. He would say his crew chief had kept the Merlin engine running like a Swiss watch. He would say his wingman Bud Anderson had covered his 6. He would say the boys in the 8th Air Force had done all the real work. The bomber crews in lightly armored B-24s who took the flak day after day and did not have the option to maneuver. And then, if the interviewer pressed him, if the interviewer asked him what it was like, personally, to be one man against 22 enemy fighters at 28,000 feet over Bremen, Yeager would give the answer he gave for the rest of his life. The answer that his squadron mates had heard in the officers' club at WWII Leiston on the evening of October 12, 1944, when the whiskey was being poured and the room was noisy with victory. He would say, "I got lucky." He didn't. But that was the man. The Second World War produced roughly 1,200 American fighter aces. Most of them are forgotten today. Their names appear in the citation records of the Air Force Historical Research Agency and nowhere else. They flew, they killed, they came home, they took off their uniforms, they went to work at hardware stores and insurance offices and gas stations across America. They raised children, they mowed lawns, they died quietly in beds surrounded by grandchildren who did not know what their grandfather had done in the sky above Germany when he was 21 years old. Chuck Yeager was one of the few whose name survived. Not because he was the best pilot of the war. There were pilots with more kills, pilots with more combat hours, pilots who took greater risks and paid greater prices. He survived in memory because he did one more thing after the war that captured the imagination of a country. He flew faster than sound, but the sound barrier was, in his own words, the easy part. It was engineering, it was mathematics, it was a controlled experiment with a specific outcome. The 26 minutes above Bremen were not. They were the moment when a 21-year-old mechanic's son, from a town of 900 people in West Virginia, a boy who scored in the bottom 5th for mechanical aptitude, who had never been in an airplane until he was 19, who had spent 4 weeks crawling through the Pyrenees with the French resistance 6 months earlier, climbed into the cockpit of an American fighter plane and made a decision that every rational calculation said would kill him. Don't run. He did not run. And because he did not run, 300 American bomber crewmen came home that night to their bunks at bases across East Anglia. They ate dinner. They wrote letters home. They flew again the next morning. None of them ever knew his name. Chuck Yeager would have preferred it that way. That was the man. That is the story. And if you have watched all the way to the end of this, if you are one of the men who has sat through 45 minutes of a stranger's voice, describing something that happened above Germany 81 years ago, then you already understand something the newsreels never captured. The war was not won by generals. It was not won by presidents. It was won by 21-year-old kids in cockpits and turret bubbles and radio compartments who made small decisions at 28,000 feet in the freezing dark and then never spoke about them again for the rest of their lives. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. It costs you nothing. It helps us keep telling these stories to men who remember when the world still knew what these men did. Subscribe if you haven't already. There are more of them out there. There are more names we haven't gotten to yet. And in the comments below, tell us about the man in your family, the father, the uncle, the grandfather, the one who came home and never talked about it. We read every single comment. We always will. Chuck Yeager didn't quit above Germany. Don't quit on this channel. We'll see you in the next one.